Thank you, Senator Baucus. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding today's hearing, and we welcome you, Secretary Geithner, to the committee. Let's begin by noting that total public debt outstanding is over $15.3 trillion, larger than the size of our gross domestic product. A debt-to-GDP ratio above 100% is clearly unsustainable and puts us on in the ranks of the many European countries currently in a severe debt crisis and unable to borrow at sustainable interest rates. The nation deserves a budget that responsibly addresses this debt crisis. Yet last year, the President delivered a budget that was unanimously rejected on the Senate floor. It did not receive a single yes vote, even from Senate Democrats. And I'll be interested to see if my colleagues are going to vote for this one. Yesterday, the President laid out his most recent budget plan. Unfortunately, it similarly fails to address the nation's glaring fiscal crisis, and it will probably never be brought to a vote. We haven't seen a budget resolution from the Senate Budget Committee in years, despite it being legally required. Last year, the President's budget did eventually get a vote, and there's only room for improvement on that result. But the Senate Majority Leader seems to have no inclination to debate a budget on the Senate floor, having stated that the Budget Control Act means that we don't have to debate fiscal year 2013 spending totals since they have already been determined. If so, then we don't need to discuss a large part of what the President unveiled yesterday, which should make for a quick hearing today. Still, we have to do our due diligence, and in reviewing the budget released yesterday by the President, it is clear that his plan would only make our fiscal problems worse and harm our economy by imposing around $1.9 trillion of stifling tax hikes. Earlier this month, the President suggested at the National Prayer Breakfast that these tax hikes are divinely inspired. That certainly was an interesting take on the Bible as far as I'm concerned. In the President's interpretation, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, becomes just give it all to Caesar. Who knew that cosmic justice would be rendered by the Department of Education and HUD? Who knew that the separation of the wheat from the chaff would in fact be performed by the Obama administration picking winners and losers in the name of fairness? Perhaps church-going citizens should just cut to the President's chase, and instead of tithing or putting an envelope in the basket of church, they could just send their money directly to the divinely ordained Treasury. The fact is, this budget is politically not divinely inspired. This budget is a plan for a permanently larger European-style government. It does not set our country down a sustainable fiscal path. It does nothing to change the President's unwavering devotion to tax and spend policies and failed stimulus schemes that have and will continue to generate historic deficits and levels of debt. It does nothing to wind down the mortgage giants, Fannie and Freddie, to restore private flows of capital into our nation's system of mortgage finance, or to remove the government's effective takeover of our housing markets. It does nothing to address our entitlement spending crisis, whistling past the graveyard as Social Security, health care, and disability trust funds are in death spirals towards bankruptcy. The President presents his budget with its accelerated spending and class warfare as one of fairness and compassion. But is it fair to American workers to jeopardize economic growth through higher taxes? Is it fair to taxpayers to ignore the mortgage giants, Fannie and Freddie, which continue to drain their wallets? Is it fair to the disabled to pretend that the looming bankruptcy of the Disability Trust Fund will not happen in 2016? And it's going to, if we don't do something about it. Is it fair to look at Social Security and turn the other way in the interest of avoiding hard choices that might make a re-election campaign uncomfortable? Secretary Geithner, I look forward to your testimony today on the President's plan and what it might do to the economy. I have to say, though, that I wish you would be careful in your public economic pronouncements. It is disturbing and unwarranted when you claim, for example, that Republicans' resistance to the President's stimulus proposals for more taxing, spending, and borrowing, as in his so-called jobs bill, means that Republicans do not want to do anything to help the economy, or that Republicans' resistance to wasteful stimulus somehow increases the risk of recession. These claims are simply not true, and they are certainly not productive. Putting aside these discouraging political statements, perhaps we could be given an explanation of why the administration appears to believe that the economic recovery is vibrant enough to be hit with more taxes, despite clear warnings from the Congressional Budget Office of significant negative effects on growth, yet at the same time is not vibrant enough to stop the runaway spending of the current administration. It seems that for President Obama, the recipe always calls for more taxes to fund more government. The result is this budget, which ignores the source of our nation's fiscal challenges, a spending problem that is only getting worse. No matter what budget baseline you choose to consider, the CBO projects that federal revenues as a share of GDP will rise above the long-run average as the economy recovers, even with a continuation of current tax rates. But spending as a share of GDP is projected to indefinitely stay above its historic norms, pushing our economy and the size of our government further and further down the path that several major European countries have followed to fiscal ruin. We also know that our fiscal outlook is very sensitive to future developments, including what might happen to interest rates or inflation. CBO tells us that if interest rates run just 1% higher than assumed in their baseline budget projection, interest outlays over the next 10 years will increase by over $1 trillion. That is for just a 1% increase. If rates spike up precipitously once our creditors lose patience with the administration's unwillingness to chart a sustainable fiscal course, we could easily face deeply painful adjustments like those currently being experienced in Europe. On the other hand, according to the CBO, if inflation turns out to be 1 percentage point higher each year than under its baseline, then the deficit would actually fall over the next 10 years. While the economy would suffer, the government would benefit from higher inflation, and it will be up to the Fed to avoid the temptation to inflate for budgetary gain. I certainly hope that the Fed's recent appetite for mixing monetary and fiscal policies comes to an end, and that we don't have to worry about the temptation to inflate our way out of our debt. Our unsustainable fiscal path poses great and growing risks to the economy, and the President's budget does nothing to diminish these risks. In fact, given the riskiness of our fiscal path and the temptation to inflate away some of our debt, Warren Buffett, who the administration appears to turn to for its formulation of tax policy, weighed in with advice for investors to steer clear of currency-based investments like U.S. Treasury securities. As Mr. Buffett says, "In God we trust" may be imprinted on our currency, but the hand that activates our government's printing press has been all too human. On bonds like Treasuries, the Oracle advises, right now bonds should come with a warning label. Secretary Geithner, Mr. Buffett is advising investors to shy away from investments such as Treasury securities, and it will be interesting to know if you agree with this advice. My hope is that his recent musings don't become a new Buffett rule for investors not to buy Treasuries, because if investors heed that advice in large numbers, the spikes in interest rates that I worry about will materialize, and the low-cost financing of our $15.3 trillion debt that the U.S. temporarily enjoys will evaporate in a hurry. We need to resist the siren song of cheap financing, partly brought on by the Federal Reserve's massive purchases of Treasury securities to help push rates down. Unfortunately, the administration remains lulled in by the siren song and takes current low rates as a reason to spend more and pile up even more debt to finance a bloated European-sized government. Secretary Geithner, I look forward to your testimony on the President's budget, which I only received late yesterday, after the deadline you were supposed to honor for submission. And again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding today's hearing, but I'm really concerned, and I don't see any real resolution to the problems that this country is currently facing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, an op-ed was written by then Senator Obama's senior economic advisors, Dr. Furman and Goolsbee, in an August 14, 2008 edition of the Wall Street Journal. I would ask unanimous consent that that be put in the record. In that op-ed, Drs. Furman and Goolsbee stated that then Senator Obama's tax proposal would reduce revenues to less than 18.2% of GDP. However, the President's 2013 budget has revenues headed up to 20.1% of GDP by 2022. According to CBO, revenues have averaged 17.9% of GDP over the last 40 years and are projected to rise to 18% by 2017, even if we extend all of the bipartisan tax relief of 2001 and 2003. In other words, even if we extend all of the 2001 and 2003 tax relief, revenues are already headed higher than their historical average, according to CBO, and OMB puts revenues even higher as a share of GDP from 2014 onward. Now, I have three questions, if you could answer them. First, considering the taxes are already heading higher than where they've been historically, should we really be raising them even more as the President proposes in his budget? Secondly, has the President abandoned his position that revenues should be less than 18.2% of GDP in his budget? And third, is he committed to keeping the size of government permanently higher, given that spending as a share of GDP has averaged over 24% during the President's term, a share the size of which we have not seen since 1946 at the end of the Second World War, and is projected to remain above 22%, which is 4 percentage points higher than when President Clinton left office.
Let me start by just noting for comparison that I think in what people refer to as the Ryan budget, the Republican budget from last year, in that budget, revenues as a share of GDP are projected to average 19% over the budget window. Even in those it's not clear how they get there, but even in that context, there's a recognition that revenues are going to need to be higher than their historic average, and that's principally because, Senator Hatch, that of the costs produced by the fact that more Americans are retiring and becoming eligible for Medicare and Social Security. Now, you're right, and I say it over and over again, that we believe the only way to get to a more sustainable fiscal position is to raise revenues through tax reform. And we proposed through tax reform raising about 1% of GDP in additional revenues. That's just 1% of GDP. Now, we don't do that because we want to do it. We do it because we see no other way to restore fiscal sustainability. One way to think about the choice is this. That's about $1.5 trillion over 10 years, 1% of GDP. If you don't do that, and you can't borrow the money, because we can't go out and borrow $1.5 trillion to avoid that, then you have to find $1.5 trillion in cuts to Medicare or low-income programs or national security to achieve that. We've looked very hard at that, as many people have, and we don't see the basis of doing it. And that's why not just the Simpson-Bowles Commission, but the bipartisan Senate group or Domenici-Rivlin all looked at this basic challenge and saying, we don't see how you get to fiscal responsibility without a balanced plan with a modest increase in revenues. Now, you can ask yourself the question, which is, what's the best way for that to happen? Of course, we all want to make sure that it happens in a way that's fair and doesn't hurt economic growth or incentives for investment. And again, we believe that the modest increases in the effective tax rate that would come from these reforms, they'd only fall in the top 2% of Americans. We think would be better for economic growth long-term and for fairness than if those tax increases were replaced by cuts in, let's say, benefits, Medicare benefits, or cuts in infrastructure investment or in education. That's the judgment we're making. Now, I know that's not universally shared, but we think the economics that are quite good, quite sound, and it's a more responsible approach, we think.
Mr. Secretary, if there are no actions by the end of this year, ordinary income and dividends will face a top tax rate of 39.6%, and the capital gains rate would rise to 20%. An additional 3.8% tax on unearned income of top earners is also scheduled to take effect in 2013 as part of Obamacare. According to a recent study, if Congress doesn't act, the integrated tax rate on dividends would rise to 68.6%, and the rate on capital gains would rise to 56.7%. The result would be that the dividend rate would be the highest among major economies, and the capital gains rate would be the second highest. With the scheduled increases in taxes on capital income, with the U.S. headed towards some of the highest taxes on such income in the developed world, and with the Congressional Budget Office telling us that such taxes will prove to be a significant drag on growth, could you explain whether you believe that those high tax rates are good for the economy and our international competitiveness? And could you also explain how the President's budget proposal, which would also significantly increase tax rates on capital income, is consistent with his objective of not returning the economy to one overly financed with debt, as his tax hikes on capital would exacerbate distortions in the tax code that favor debt financing over equity financing?
A good and thoughtful, complicated question, so let me try and be responsive to those.
Okay.
I think the basic choice we face is, can we restore fiscal responsibility without raising revenues through tax reform?
Okay.
Now, the statistics you cited are a good argument for tax reform. And although you're right, we have proposed some specific changes that you could do on top of the current tax system to raise more revenues. We think the better way to get there is through comprehensive tax reform that would lower rates and broaden the base. And we think you can do that in a way that would be balanced well, these basic objectives of growth and fairness longer term. But your concerns I understand, but they're a good argument for doing this through tax reform. Again, I think the basic divide between us, though, is not really this. The basic divide between us is, can you restore fiscal responsibility and still meet our commitments to retirees and seniors, still preserve some capacity to invest in education infrastructure and meet our national security needs? Can you meet those objectives without adding any revenues, without getting any revenues out of our current tax system? We don't think you can do that. That's why we're drawn to this position reluctantly. And we think that burden of those increased revenues can be most fairly borne by the most fortunate 2% of Americans. You can say you should spread the pain more broadly, but the average American is going to bear most of the rest of the burden of the deficit reduction that's going to come in spending restraint. So again, we face constraints on our resources we have not faced in generations. It's going to require us making very tough choices. But I do not see how you get there if you are unable to contemplate and to embrace modest increases in revenues through tax reform. I just don't think it's possible.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't keep you much longer, Mr. Secretary. I know you want to go. You wanted to go when you first got here. And I wouldn't blame you.
I'd be happy to continue it.
No. Let me just say this on Senator Kyle's question. The Joint Committee on Taxation did say that the bottom 51% of all households do not pay any income taxes at all. You raised the issue that they pay payroll taxes. Yes, but that's Social Security. We all do that. But about 23 million of them, according to joint tax, receive refundable tax credits that are more than they pay in payroll taxes. So in essence, they're not really paying anything. And another 15.5 million people get refundable tax credits that are more than both they and their employer pay in payroll taxes. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should tax the truly poor. I don't think anybody wants to do that. We want to help them. And I've spent 36 years here trying to help people. But I am suggesting that we've got to lift people out of the current situation where they are paying taxes and that base is spread, and there's no way we'll ever get there, it seems to me, with this administration's approach. Because you want to raise taxes on the upper 2%, but I don't see any of that money going for deficit reduction. Now, maybe you think it is, but I don't see any of it going for deficit reduction. I don't see us making real headway. I see us as at 100% of GDP and national debt. I see our our spending is now gone up to 74.3% or something like that of GDP. From 69, it was 43% under George Bush, but now going to be 70. It won't be long till we're 100% spending of GDP. We all know that we're spending too much. And these are some of the things that are driving me bats up here. Because tell me how you're going to get the deficit down when he comes up with all kinds of more programs to spend money on. And in the process, we're not lifting the economy at all. We're making it a worse economy. And I've also added to that it's based upon low interest rates that we know are going to go up. Now, I think those are fair questions.
They're totally fair questions. Could I respond to those questions?
Sure.
Let me just try and go through those questions. Let me just first start with the magnitude of our debt problems, because you used a bunch of numbers I want to put in perspective.
Well, tell me they're wrong, those numbers.
You're absolutely right that we have unsustainable deficits, and if we don't figure out a way to restore gravity...
But where does this budget where does it make a difference in deficits?
You know, one of the great things about our country, Senator Hatch, is that we use a neutral, independent arbiter of our policies and yours to judge their impact on the deficit. And our policies, which CBO will evaluate for you, will show, if Congress were to enact them, they would bring our deficits down from their current level, unsustainable levels, to a level that is sustainable. And we define sustainable, as most economists would, as a level, and this is the minimum you have to do, where the debt stops growing as a share of our economy. And if the Congress were to adopt these proposals, even under reasonably conservative assumptions, then our debt burden as a share of the economy, this is debt held by the public, and debt net of financial assets, which is the appropriate way to measure it, will stabilize in the 70s as a percent of GDP. Now, that'd be good if we were high, if we were lower over time.
You're telling me the deficit's going to go down? I don't believe that.
Oh, absolutely. If you,
you're going to have to prove that to me, because I don't believe it one bit.
It's just a matter of, it depends on what Congress does. Of course, in the Constitution, you know, we can only propose. Congress has to enact. But if Congress were to enact the President's proposals.
I'm talking about the President's proposals.
Then they will bring the deficit down from the current level of just above 8.5%.
Look, I have a lot of respect for you. I think you're a very bright man, and you've had one of the toughest jobs in history, and I acknowledge that. But I don't believe you can make that case.
Oh, absolutely. And that, but you don't
have to make it in writing to me.
But you don't have to. You don't have to trust our judgment, because again, the great strength of our country is that CBO can show you.
You write it to me in writing. How you think we're going to knock the deficit down with the current budget that this president has offered to us?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, it'll come down dramatically over time. In fact, it'll come down much faster than you think. The question is whether, I think what we disagree on really is whether we should cut much more quickly than we propose to cut. And as I said in my opening remarks, our judgment is that would hurt the economy quite badly. Or how we do it in the composition of it.
I would just like to lift our workers and our economy by providing more opportunity and
we share that benefit. And I know you do. Yeah, I'll be that objective. I want to just point out one thing. You're right to say that rates are low today. Interest rates are low today.
They're not only low, they're almost non-existent.
Well, the 10-year money, 10 years yield of treasuries is about 2%.
Yeah.
And you're right that is a reflection of lots of different things. But it is...
Have you factored in how, if they start going up to normal rates...
I'm gonna embrace part of your point. So I want to explain to you that they're low in part because the concern in Europe, and because growth is not that strong anywhere. But they're also low because investors around the world judge those securities, those Treasury securities, as a relatively safe bet, and they believe that the Congress of the United States ultimately will act to restore fiscal responsibility soon enough so we can avoid the risk you and I both would worry about a lot, which is that if Congress does not act, that over time those interest rates would rise and hurt growth. There is no risk of that. I don't see any risk of that now, but we would better position to avoid that risk if Congress were to enact on a sensible set of deficit reduction proposals over time. Right now, almost any measure you can look at about how people judge the relative security of U.S. financial assets, including treasuries, they judge us as in a very strong position to meet our long-term fiscal challenges, because they have a lot of confidence ultimately this Congress will act and come together and do some sensible things in that context, but that requires action by the Congress.
Mr. Secretary, I just have to ask a couple of other questions because of what I've heard here today. I don't agree with you on your analysis, but you know, you have all kinds of economists working with you, and I can't ignore the fact that you're in a position to be able to make those statements. But why does the President want to raise taxes in any way on small businesses with unemployment at 8.3%? I mean, don't small businesses with taxable income over $200,000 help the unemployment situation by creating and retaining jobs? I mean, we all know that businesses will get hit with the President's tax hikes, even if their owners don't take 1 penny out of the business and instead plow it all back into workers' salaries or into building the business. The President says small businesses create 2/3 of the new jobs in this country. My worry is, why does he want to take more of their money that they could use to hire more workers and retain the ones that they have. Now, I know you're aware that 50% of all flow-through business income is subject to the President's proposed rate hikes. That's a fact. And you seem to dismiss concerns about increasing taxes on businesses with incomes over $200,000 in taxable income, whether their owners take out any of their income at all. And why are you not more concerned about increasing taxes on these small businesses with jobs still as scarce as they are? And remember that this president promised unemployment wouldn't go above 8% if his stimulus was enacted. It's been over 8% for 32 straight months now. And let me make one last comment about this, and then, of course, glad to hear your response. And I think I've been very fair to you over your tenure. I personally think
brave.
I think you're a very bright guy, and I think that you are a very smart guy and a very hard worker. I think you're very wrong on a lot of things, to be honest with you. But let me just say this. Why hammer millionaires in the small business group? I mean, you know, small business owners are the job creators, especially in rural America. And according to CRS, 75% of those making $1 million or more in income are small business owners. 75%. Now, that group already pays plenty. Their effective tax rate is 29%. So they're already paying the Buffett rule. There's not much doubt about it. You know, I just have a real rough time with this. We've got to keep increasing taxes, but we can't provide any incentives to the economy, especially small business, that really create 70% of the jobs, and get us so we pull us out of this so that it's more than 49% paying the whole freight in this country.
Senator, of course, respect your views on this, and we've had a lot of conversation about this, so let me just say a few things in response, but I don't think I'm going to change your mind.
We haven't had too many on this one. I mean, well, you and I haven't, I'll put it that way.
We have significantly reduced taxes on small businesses in the first 3 years of the president's first term. We propose in the budget additional reductions in taxes on small businesses. For example, zero capital gains on new investments in small businesses, extending very generous expensing provisions. We think those are good economic policy given the challenges we face as a country.
I agree with that.
Now, I'm not a politician, but I've never met anybody in public office that ever wants to be in favor of raising any taxes on anybody. But as you know, and as you've said eloquently, we face unsustainable fiscal deficits. We have to find a way to figure out how to dig our way out of that, restore some balance. As you've heard us discuss all morning, we don't see a way to do that that's fair and consistent with our other obligations as officials to do that without some modest increase in revenues. And we want to make sure those revenues come from the people that are in the best position to bear that burden. And these proposals will affect a very, very, very small, tiny fraction of small businesses. Now, it does affect some small businesses, but most of those small businesses, very substantial fraction of them, are not small by any definition. They make substantial amounts of earnings. I think more than half make more than $1 million in taxable income, meaning taxes income after expenses. So we don't do this with any enthusiasm. We just do it out of the recognition that we face terribly difficult fiscal challenges. We're adding substantial burdens on average Americans because of the broader cuts in spending happening across the government, across the economy. And we think to avoid putting additional burdens on middle-class Americans, on retirees, on a defense budget that's already been cut substantially, we have to find some ways to raise some revenue sensibly through tax reform. That's why we're taking this approach. We don't do it with any enthusiasm. We just think it's better than the alternatives.
Okay, I've only been here 36 years, but I've gone through it over and over, where Democrat administrations come in and say, we just need more taxes, and we will cut spending. We have given them the more taxes, and the spending has never been cut.
Well, again, I think this is a good debate to have, and I think, again, if you look at any independent evaluation of what we've proposed on the spending side, you will see that we're proposing to cut spending by between $2.5 and $3 trillion, depending if you include interest, between $2.5 and $3 trillion over 10 years. spending across the government, all parts of government, including defense, with substantial savings for Medicare and Medicaid. Now, again, it's only in that context, 2.5 spending cuts for every dollar of revenue increases, that we think a modest amount of revenues makes some sense. If, again, we have to make choices, governing's about choices, about alternatives. If we don't do that modest amount of revenues, where are we going to find the savings to make sure we can live within our means? Now, if you're going to not find 1% of GDP in revenues, you're going to have to figure out a way to cut benefits, cut education, cut Medicare, Medicaid, cut defense further.
Yeah, there's no entitlement reforms being offered by this administration. Not
Senator,
a dime of it.
That's not true. The budget includes $360 billion
restraint of growth
in savings and reforms to Medicare, Medicaid. And compare the Medicare ones to the alternatives we've seen from your side of the aisle. You guys go much, much deeper in transforming changes to Medicare over time, what we would never support, but we are trying to find responsible, sensible ways to get more savings out of the Medicare, Medicaid system, because as we all recognize, we've made unsustainable commitments in those programs.
And also in the budget, you're taking credit for war reductions and a lot of other things that may or may not be real.
Well, I'm glad you raised that question. We're treating the overseas contingency operations, which is the budget that pays for foreign wars, we're treating it, I think, more carefully and more responsibly even than the Republican budget of last year. We're treating it like the Republican budget last year. We're proposing to count those savings and allocate a substantial fraction, but we allocate the savings differently. We're proposing to put most of it to deficit reduction, part of it to a substantial infrastructure investment program. But in general, we're being consistent with the way those things have been treated, not just in the Republican budget more recently, but in the past.
Well, let me just say this. You have a tough job, and I don't want to make it any more tough than it is. But I'm really concerned because I don't think anybody up here wants to cut entitlement programs if they can avoid it. But we also know that's where we've got to find savings. If our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, in our case, want to have a future. And there isn't, I just don't see it in this particular budget, in the President's budget. Look, you have a very difficult job. You work very, very hard. I don't think you get as much credit as you deserve. On the other hand, I don't agree with you. I actually think that this administration is putting us into real jeopardy. And I don't blame you for that completely. But we're going to have to get real about it.
You know, I think, Senator, again, we recognize that we're going to have pretty significant changes to the trajectory of growth in Medicare and Medicaid.
Well, I don't see it in this budget.
Well, you can ask for more, but then you have to decide how you're going to get more and how deep you're going to go in benefits.
That's what we're talking about. You're our guy.
But I was going to make a slightly different point, which is that, as you know, we don't think it's realistic or fair to consider even those changes we propose on entitlement reform without changes to the tax system that asks.
Okay, now I agree with that. Yeah. I think
you got to do them together.
I think we do need to modify our tax system. I don't think there's any question about it, but we ought to make it so that we can create jobs and opportunities and magnify the small business community, which I don't think your budget does.
But we're going to have to raise some revenues from the tax system. We can't do it without raising revenues. And so when we talk about entitlement reform alongside tax reform, we're talking about entitlement reform that saves real money and tax reform that helps contribute to deficit reduction. We think we need both those things. We're not going to move forward either one without both.
No. Well, I think we're overtaxed now. I don't want to raise revenues. I'd rather have us make the tough decisions and see what we can do to get things under control. Now I know you want to get down to the dinner. And I have so many more questions, and very seldom am I all by myself, so I can ask anything I want.
Well, I'll come see you. Invite me to come see you. I'll come talk to you.
Okay, I will invite you to come see me. I just want you to know that you've inherited a very difficult job at one of the toughest times in history. I have respect for how hard you work. I know that you are trying to do the best you can. I would like to see you convince this president of some of the things that you and I both know he ought to be convinced of. But in any event, I always respect people who work hard, and you're one of the hardest workers I've seen. I wish you'd work a little less hard on some of these crazy ideas that this administration has, but I just want you to know that I've really appreciated your testimony today. I've appreciated the amount of time you've given to this committee, and I appreciate how hard you really work. So with that, we'll let you go, and I don't see anybody else. We'll let you go, and thank you for taking the time. You are going to come see me, though, and you're going to convince me about some of these things.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. With that,
Hearing is
we'll,
adjourned.
what?
Adjourned.
With that, we'll recess until further notice. Thank you.